Es ist mir eine große Freude, hier zu stehen heute. And that's the only German I'm going to speak. But I am very pleased to be here. And I have no PowerPoint, and I have no little green laser. I've just got some words, and then I hope maybe you'll have some questions for me. So, can everyone hear me properly? Yeah? So yes, my name is Nicci Gerrard. And until 2 years ago, I would describe myself as a writer. So I write novels under my own name and psychological thrillers with my husband under the name of Nicky French. As a journalist, I was for many years on the Observer newspaper and still write for that newspaper. And as a humanist celebrant, so I conduct funerals for people who have no faith. And now I add that I'm a campaigner. And as often happens, my campaign was born out of a bitter personal experience. So, John's campaign is named for my father, John Gerrard. And I know that perhaps it's a futile attempt to rescue him when he's beyond rescue. But it's also a tiny part of a huge movement for more compassionate care for those who live with dementia, for the frail and the vulnerable who can no longer speak for themselves. So I'm here then as an expert in experience and as someone who believes that the self is very precarious and that hospital can be terrifyingly hazardous. And intensive care can also mean intensive fear. And I also believe that there are simple and humane things we can do to make it less fearful and less hazardous. So I want to start, before anything else, of just saying something about the meaning of home. I don't mean home as bricks and mortar, but home as a place you know your way around, where faces are familiar, routines settled, where the photos on the wall remind you of your past and those who you love. Home is a place, then, of safety and of belonging, where you don't feel scared and confused and adrift. So hospital, obviously, is very far from home. Even for people who are self-confident and healthy, it's a scary place, full of machines and rules and corridors and bright lights and experts, strange noises, tubes put in your mouth, bands wrapped around your arm, food you do not like at a time that you do not want. You take a person who is frail out of their home and you put them in this unfamiliar, alien environment, and you take them from safety to fear, and they can get lost. And sometimes they can get so lost that they never find themselves again. So my father, John, he had Alzheimer's for 10 years, but he lived well with the condition, at home with my mother, who he'd been married to for 61 years, working in the garden that he loved a great deal, feeding the bird, watering the tomatoes, walking by the river, visiting friends, teasing his grandchildren, telling vivid stories about his past. He went into hospital with leg ulcers that weren't healing. The hospital had very rigidly enforced visiting hours. And then they also had an outbreak of norovirus, which meant that there was a virtual lockdown of the hospital and a ban on all visitors while it lasted. This meant that he went for many days without any visitors. And I think looking back on it now, he must have felt abandoned, and actually he was abandoned. So he went in healthy, continent, mobile, articulate, contented. He came out skeletal, so he lost a third of his body weight in that month, incontinent completely, immobile completely. He couldn't even sit up in bed, let alone put one foot in front of another. Inarticulate completely. He could barely utter a word and wrecked. So he lost almost everything. And we kind of lost him. So we took him home and we hired a 24-hour carer, and we thought that maybe we could get him back, that by doing all the things that we had not done for him when he was in hospital, talking to him, reading to him, feeding him, keeping him mobile, singing songs, playing music, giving him his favourite food, holding his hand, looking into his eye, stroking his white hair, laughing, telling him that we loved him and that he would be home soon and that we were going to keep him safe, that we would perhaps get him back from the place that he'd drifted to, but we didn't. And he died 9 months later. And now I think of those 9 months not really like living, but like a radically slowed down dying. And the reason, of course, that I'm sharing this story, my father's story, is that what I realized too late is that it's the story of thousands of people, of men and women, up and down the country in UK, up and down the country in every country. People with dementia are very fragile and they can very easily become untethered from their world. So I'm very clear, it wasn't ever the nurses' fault. They were kind and hardworking and completely unable to provide my father or the other patients in his ward with the level of time and attention that they needed. And it wasn't the doctor's fault. They cured his leg ulcers, which is what they were there to do. We should have prevented him from going into hospital. And if he had to go, we should have stayed with him. We should have broken the rules that told us to keep out, and we should have protected him from the damage. If he couldn't be at home, then home should have followed him. And I didn't know that then, and I know it now, and I want other people to know it. So my father died at the beginning of November 2014. 3 weeks later, with a friend, I launched John's campaign, whose aim is simple and single issue, but which also, I think, opens a door onto a world of more compassionate, person-centred care in hospital. Our mission statement is very short. It simply says that the carers of people with dementia should have the same rights as parents of sick children to accompany them while in hospital, and that people with dementia should have the right to be so accompanied. And we talk about rights, not duties, because we know that carers often have a desperate need of respite themselves. We say that carers should not simply be allowed to have unrestricted access to those they care for. They should be welcomed as part of the team of support, for they are the experts in experience. They are the voice, they are the memory. They can be the patient's link to the world. We believe that hospital staff should pull the door open to welcome carers in and to make them feel valued. And we also believe that carers should feel empowered to push that door from the other side, although this can take courage, because hospital is a very intimidating place. We recognise that there sometimes may be issues of privacy and dignity, and that there has to be clear communication between the hospital staff and the carers, so that boundaries are established and expectations clearly laid out. But if communication is clear from the outside, there is no reason at all why there should not be unrestricted access. And there is every reason why there has to be that access. Everyone wins. The nurses win, the doctors win, the carers win, and above all, the person with dementia wins. So I think times are changing. The model of healthcare is largely built on that kind of one-off heroic intervention. And intensive care is an obvious example of this. But today, with ageing populations, patients who are frail are often in hospital for weeks, months even. Their well-being has to be attended to, as well as their illness. So Julia and I, who run this campaign, were just two middle-aged women, and we run it in our spare time. But we've been helped and supported and joined by hundreds of individuals. And because the timing was right, and because culture around dementia is changing, we've achieved a great deal of success already. So in the UK, more than 450 hospitals and hospital trusts have signed up to our campaign. Because why wouldn't they? Because everybody benefits. The doctors can be doctors, the nurses can be nurses, the carers can care, the patients can be looked after, their personhood protected. A recent report by Alzheimer's shows that patients with dementia stay longer, experience worse outcomes, are less likely to be returned to their own homes, are more likely to be readmitted within the month. But there is increasingly robust evidence that where they are accompanied by their loved ones, then outcomes significantly are improved. They stay for a shorter time. They are readmitted less often. There are fewer falls. They are less likely to be malnourished and dehydrated. They are more likely to remain mobile. They are more likely to go back to their own homes rather than into residential ones. They are less likely to need social care. And above all, it is less likely that they'll fall off their baseline and become more cognitively impaired. So our campaign goes a long way to reducing the unacceptable variations in end-of-life care and that Russian roulette of fluctuating standards. But you know, even if the practical and the economic benefits were not so measurable, it would be the right thing to do, the humane and the moral thing to do. For people who are frail, need person-centered, compassionate care and vigilance at a level that is almost impossible for hospital staff to provide, no matter how hardworking and wonderful they are, especially now that 1 in 3 patients have dementia. 1 in 3. I don't know if it's the same in Germany, and I don't know if Germany is going through the same kind of healthcare crisis that we are in the UK. It's really horribly easy to start thinking of old people with multiple conditions and complex needs just as economic costs. There's a cruel language that's grown up around them, their burdens, their statistics, their problems. There's a phrase for them that we have: bed blockers, objects of pity, sometimes discuss, not subjects to be treated with respect and with empathy. But no, there are people who have led a long life and are now at their time of greatest need, and we mustn't forget that they are human and that they're precious. So 450 hospitals in the UK is a lot, and sometimes I'm astonished by how far we've come in the 2 years that we've been fighting this campaign, and bowled over by the kindness of strangers, the dedication of hospital staff, the heroism of carers, and the courage of many people with dementia. And sometimes I am really astonished that there should have to be a need for this campaign of ours in the first place, that we have to fight for the right of those who are vulnerable, confused, and often terrified to have their carers with them when they're in hospital. It goes against basic principles of kindness, but we do need to fight. So I'll finish by saying that I often think of my father, and he was a carer too. For several decades, he looked after my mother, who had complex health problems of her own, and he looked after her with a tireless devotion. Yet when the time came, we did not do the same for him. I mean, it wasn't exactly our fault. We didn't know what was going to happen. It wasn't the fault of the nurses or the doctors who treated him kindly, who healed his leg ulcers. It was a system, impersonal and bureaucratic, that kept us away, that kept him lying alone in his hospital bed. So not to have looked after him is the great burden now. To care for someone is hard, but it's a gift as well. We care for each other in our times of need. We look after each other as we hope to be looked after in our turn. That's what makes a society. So care is kindness in action. And John's campaign is enabling that kindness, that love, at a time when it is most needed, opening the doors, letting the right ones in. Thank you. So maybe there are questions.